Warning: this is a work of fiction, or a more verbose version. All names, characters, businesses, places, events and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Part 1: The Unification of Frankford. The history of Frankford is not a tale of a single king's conquest but of a long, arduous journey from a collection of divided tribes to a unified kingdom. For centuries, the land was a chaotic, fragmented tapestry of competing clans. The fierce Iron Valesmen of the northern mountains lived in perpetual conflict with the nomadic Riverlanders of the central plains, and ancient feuds over grazing rights and sacred fishing grounds fueled endless cycles of violence. There was no shared identity, only a brutal, unending struggle for survival and dominance. The process of unification began with a legendary, visionary figure known to history as the Unifier, born a minor chieftain named Calon. Through a campaign that was both ruthless and strategic, he began to forge a new nation. He was a master diplomat who secured alliances through solemn blood compacts and marriage arrangements, winning the loyalty of clans like the Plainsfolk with promises of peace and shared prosperity. However, he was also a cunning warlord who crushed all opposition with an unrelenting military force, culminating in his decisive victory at the Battle of Whispering Stones, where his forces shattered the armies of the rebellious Valesmen. Upon his death, his son inherited this burgeoning territory and declared it the first kingdom of Frankford. The next 11 generations of his lineage would dedicate themselves to fulfilling his father's ambition. This was not a peaceful process, it was a generational crucible. The second king faced a massive betrayal by a coalition of tribes who signed a treaty of blood to undo his father's work. The third king had to quell a series of dynastic plots by his own relatives. The fifth ruler presided over a devastating plague that nearly broke the kingdom's newfound unity, forcing the crown to rebuild its authority from the ground up. With each successive generation, the rulers of Frankfurt fought, schemed, and married their way to power, steadily expanding the borders and breaking the old tribal loyalties. It was a long, bloody, and painful process, but it forged a single, resilient nation from the ashes of centuries of tribal warfare. Part 2: The Age of Conflict and Colonialism. After a hard-won, but brief, 30 years of peace, the newly unified kingdom was once again drawn into a long period of conflict. The peace was a precious respite, a time of reconstruction and flourishing new trade that gave the Frankish people a taste of what a stable nation could be. But the peace was shattered on two fronts. On its eastern border, a series of frequent, grinding border wars with its rival, Bavaria, erupted. These were not glorious, decisive battles but costly, attritional skirmishes fought in a sprawling, mountainous borderland known as the Shadow Passes. The fighting was brutal and exhausting, as soldiers spent months fighting for a few hundred feet of treacherous terrain, and it drained the treasury. Simultaneously, a far-reaching naval war began with the great maritime nation of Ethelgard over control of valuable northern trade routes. This struggle was a new kind of war, fought not on land, but on the high seas. Vast fleets of creaking naval ships, their cannons thundering across the waves, clashed in battles like the pivotal Battle of the Gilded Strait, where Frankfurt's ambition to dominate the waves was met with fierce resistance. This dual conflict, a two-front war on both land and sea, lasted for decades and consumed the kingdom's resources at an unsustainable rate. The royal treasury became a gaping maw, swallowing up taxes and tithes to fund new regiments and repair damaged ships. It was in this state of financial desperation that the continents of North and South Etherian were discovered. Frankford, despite its ongoing conflicts and insatiable need for coin, was a key player in the race to establish colonies. They saw the untapped riches of the New World as a crucial lifeline, a desperate gamble to secure gold, timber, and other resources to fuel their costly wars at home. They sent fleets of ships across a perilous sea, filled with colonists and soldiers, hoping to find a new source of wealth. Over the next 400 years, these colonies flourished, eventually forming their own sovereign nations and charting their own course. The nation of Frankfurt had become a land defined by unending war at home and relentless expansion abroad, with its fate hanging precariously on the promise of the New World. Part 3: The Frankish Revolution. The seeds of revolution were sown over a century of financial mismanagement and aristocratic decadence. For 500 years after the Etherian nations were formed, the Frankish monarchy, specifically the ruling house of Valois, stretched thin by its costly wars and a series of failed colonial ventures, began a precipitous and irreversible financial decline. The royal court, headquartered in its sprawling capital, became a grotesque and out-of-touch display of gold-leafed opulence and extravagance, while the rest of the country was burdened by crippling taxes, widespread poverty, and persistent crop failures. The public, enduring brutal famines and mounting debt, grew increasingly disillusioned with a monarchy that was not only out of touch but seemed actively indifferent to their suffering. This simmering discontent finally boiled over, igniting a popular revolution that swept across the kingdom with a speed and ferocity no one had anticipated. The uprising was brutally swift, led by a charismatic revolutionary firebrand named Jean-Luc, who mobilized the common people into a raging mob. The revolution culminated in a violent storming of the royal palace, and in a shocking and symbolic act of rebellion. The king, queen, and every member of the royal family were led to a public square and executed by the mob. In a radical and unprecedented break from its monarchical past, a new democracy was founded from the ashes of the old kingdom, charting a new and uncertain future for the nation, forever stained by the blood of its past rulers. Part 4: A New Era of War. The newly formed democracy, still finding its footing, quickly forged a powerful military and financial alliance with its former naval rival, Ethelgard. This alliance, cemented by the Treaty of the Azure Sea, sparked a new and prosperous age for the nation. The treaty brought a new flow of wealth into Frankfurt and, crucially, gave it access to Ethelgard's superior shipbuilding and its highly trained mercenary legions. This made the new republic's military a force to be reckoned with. With renewed confidence and a desire to prove its strength on the world stage, Frankfurt began to aggressively encroach on the trade routes of its old rival, Florence. The escalating tension came to a head when Frankfurt's navy, bolstered by its new resources, executed a bold and strategic maneuver, seizing the popular trade port of Port Asa on a large island in the Blue Sea, located off the coast of Zurida. This single act ignited a brutal war between the two nations, the first major war fought on a continental scale with muskets. The widespread adoption of these weapons, which required far less training than previous armaments, meant that a much larger portion of the population could be conscripted into service. This led to a dramatic increase in the size of armies and, tragically, a staggering rise in casualties. The conflict was a brutal, two-front struggle, with battles taking place on the small, strategic islands of the Blue Sea and in the rugged, mountainous border regions. This new form of warfare, with its increased lethality and reliance on organized volleys, shattered the old traditions of combat and left a devastating mark on both nations. Part 5: The Long Peace and the Seeds of War. During the 1780s of the Third Era, Frankfurt enjoyed a period of prosperity and optimism. The new democratic government had solidified its power, trade with Ethelgard flourished, and the nation turned its attention inward, focused on reconstruction and the ideals of liberty it had fought so hard to secure. But while Frankfurt basked in its hard-won peace, a fierce colonial revolt began to brew in the vast continent of Zurida. The indigenous peoples, driven by a desire for sovereignty, rose up against the brutal fascist government of Bavaria, which ruled the colonies with an iron fist. The Zaridan people fought a relentless guerrilla war of independence, struggling to form their own nations under constant assault by the technologically superior Bavarian army and navy. Frankfurt, seeing a mirror of its own revolutionary past in the Zaridan struggle, made a bold decision. 5 years after the end of the war with Florence, the Frankish democracy began to covertly send military aid to the Zaridan rebels. Ships laden with muskets, gunpowder, and advisors were smuggled in under the guise of merchants, actively helping the rebels establish fledgling governments and national identities. This foreign intervention infuriated Bavaria, which saw it not as a matter of principle, but as a deliberate and humiliating act of war. After decades of costly and bloody fighting, by 1888, Bavaria suffered a catastrophic military and economic defeat and was finally forced to abandon its colonial claims in Zurida entirely. Their colonial jewel was lost, their pride wounded, and their treasury drained. From the ashes of this defeat, the fascist government began a secret and methodical process of rearmament and mobilization. Factory towns hummed with production, military academies became training grounds for a new, unforgiving military doctrine, and every citizen was indoctrinated with the singular, burning goal of vengeance. Their target was clear: Frankfurt, the nation they blamed for their downfall. Frankfurt, for its part, was completely unaware of Bavaria's thirst for vengeance. Secure in its alliances and its own democratic ideals, Frankfurt believed the peace on the continent was solid. The nation's leaders were so blinded by their own ideological self-righteousness that they failed to see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It would not be until 1894 that Bavaria would finally be ready to unleash the full force of its new army, surprising a Frankish nation blissfully unaware of the coming storm. Part 6: The Great War and the Age of Trenches. In the spring of 1894, Bavaria finally launched its long-awaited invasion, a brutal and meticulously planned surprise attack. Bavarian forces, driven by a desire for vengeance, swept across the border with lightning speed, killing any civilians in their path in a rapid advance. The world of warfare had been fundamentally changed by a new generation of deadly technology. Muskets were now obsolete, replaced by high-powered bolt-action rifles that made every soldier a more lethal force. Cannons had evolved into powerful, long-range artillery that could level entire farmhouses from miles away. And the most terrifying new weapon was the machine gun, which could scythe down entire battalions in seconds. The initial assault caught Frankfurt completely off guard, and the Bavarian army was able to push 10 miles deep into Frankfurt's territory before the military could fully mobilize and mount a counterattack. By the end of 1895, the war had become a bloody stalemate. Both sides, armed with new, devastating weapons, quickly realized that a head-on charge was a death sentence. They began to dig into the earth, and the conflict transformed into a brutal, grinding trench warfare. Battle after battle was fought in miserable conditions, with soldiers charging into a storm of bullets and shells across no man's land for no significant territorial gains on either side. It became a war of attrition, with the only real victor being death itself. In 1901, the two nations, exhausted and financially drained from years of bloodshed, signed a ceasefire. However, neither side considered the war to be truly over. They used the temporary pause not for peace, but to fortify their positions and bring their forces back up to full strength, preparing for the day the fighting would inevitably resume. All stories are 100% written by Joshua A. Cinquemani and read to you by AI. Please like and subscribe to help the channel grow, and we hope to see you in the next video.